Asheville, a city known for its majestic mountains and peaceful atmosphere, was about to be rocked by an event that no one saw coming. It was a spring morning on April 15th, 2024, and the city was beginning to wake up to a new day. In the quiet neighborhood of Oak Ridge, Elizabeth Turner, a young psychology student at the University of Asheville, was about to face a revelation that would change her life forever. Elizabeth was 23 years old and known for her reserved nature and her deep interest in psychology. She was looking forward to a day of rest, but fate had other plans for her. Her mother, Nancy Turner, contacted her the night before with shocking news. A half-brother, Thomas Turner, had been found and was in town. Thomas was his father's illegitimate son, a secret the family had kept for years. Nancy had decided it was time for Elizabeth to meet Thomas, believing it could be a way to unite the family and resolve past issues. The meeting was scheduled for a local cafe, Highland Brew, a cozy place known for its rustic decor. It was a local neutral, chosen to ease the tension of an environmentally uncomfortable meeting. Elizabeth arrived early, feeling a mix of anxiety and curiosity. She sat at a table by the window, watching the street as she waited. Thomas arrived punctually, and the first impression was of a man in his 30s, with a slightly unkempt appearance and an expression that carried a shadow of melancholy. He moved away from Elizabeth with a nervous smile, extending his hand to shake her. The tension was not palpable. "Elizabeth?" Thomas asked, with a voice that mixed nervousness and hope. "Yes, it's me," Elizabeth replied, trying to hide her own apprehension. "Nice to meet you, Thomas." They sat down and started talking about their lives, trying to fill in the gaps in a broken family story. Thomas spoke about his difficult childhood and how he had only recently discovered his true parentage. Elizabeth, in turn, told about her academic life and interests. However, as the conversation progressed, the tone began to change. Thomas began to reveal more intimate and personal details about his life. He started talking about his fetishes and desires, something that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. The revelations began to become increasingly disconcerting, and to Elizabeth, every word seemed like an invitation into unknown and disturbing territory. Thomas talked about a fetish that involved control and submission, something he had explored only in his most private thoughts. Elizabeth, although surprised, tried to remain calm and listen. However, Thomas's revelations were increasingly disturbing, and she didn't know how to react. "I know this may seem strange, but it's something I've carried for a long time," Thomas said, with an intense look. "I always thought that one day I could find someone who understood that." Elizabeth tried to divert the conversation to more neutral topics, but the atmosphere was charged. The conversation ended abruptly, with both getting up and saying goodbye coldly. Elizabeth felt momentary relief as she left the cafe, but also a growing discomfort. Something about the way Thomas spoke and his revelations was making her uneasy. When Elizabeth returned home, she began to reflect on the encounter. Thomas's revelation about his fetishes and disturbing desires was lingering in his mind. She wondered if she should have approached the situation differently, or if there was something she could have done to avoid the discomfort she felt. However, what seemed like just a family reunion would become the beginning of a series of events that would uncover a dark and disturbing side of Thomas. The meeting that seemed like a simple family reunion was about to reveal a much darker and more dangerous truth. After their disconcerting encounter at Highland Brew, Elizabeth Turner and Thomas Turner continued to see each other more frequently, although their relationship had changed in subtle and disturbing ways. Their initial meeting had left Elizabeth with a feeling of discomfort, but, paradoxically, also a growing curiosity about the half-brother she had just met. Over the next few days, Elizabeth tried to adjust to this new dynamic. Thomas, feeling that the meeting had not been entirely productive, tried to maintain contact through messages and calls. He seemed determined to deepen his bond with Elizabeth, and this, paradoxically, attracted her attention. At first, Elizabeth was skeptical and tried to maintain a certain emotional distance. However, Thomas continued to make efforts to get closer, suggesting lunch dates and walks around the city. One Saturday afternoon, they met again, this time at the local park, a popular place among Asheville residents. The idea was a more casual conversation, outdoors, away from the oppressive environment of the cafe where they had met previously. During the meeting, Thomas started talking again about his preferences and fetishes, but in a more detailed way. He shared fantasies that involved absolute control, domination, and submission. expressing a deep and persistent desire for a relationship that was both emotionally and physically intense. For Thomas, these fetishes were not just about sexual desire, but about deep psychological control, something he had experienced in thoughts and fantasies but never in practice. Elizabeth was disconcerted. What had started as a simple family gathering now seemed to be taking a more personal and disturbing turn. Thomas, sensing her discomfort, tried to justify her fantasies as a natural part of her personality and her desire to connect with someone who shared these interests. He expressed a hope that Elizabeth might somehow understand him and, perhaps, even engage in these practices with him. Despite her growing discomfort, Elizabeth found herself curious and, in a way, attracted to the intensity with which Thomas spoke about his desires. The idea of exploring something so intimate and unconventional seemed both repulsive and fascinating. Curiosity about her own emotional and psychological limits led her to consider what was being proposed. Thomas, noticing the change in Elizabeth's attitude, began to suggest more private meetings. He invited her to his home, a small, simple apartment in a less crowded area of the city. The invitation was made casually, as a natural extension of the meetings they were having, but Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety. On April 22nd, Elizabeth decided to accept the invitation. She headed to Thomas's apartment with a mixture of anxiety and expectation. The environment was discreet, but with decor that reflected a restless and unconventional personality. There were several pieces of abstract art and furniture with a peculiar style, as well as a collection of books on psychology and human behavior. During their meeting, Thomas began to explore his fantasies and desires more deeply, presenting Elizabeth with several items he had acquired to experiment with these practices. He spoke about them with a mixture of excitement and seriousness, which only increased Elizabeth's feelings of discomfort and curiosity. The conversation became increasingly intense, and the atmosphere between them became charged with a tension that seemed to be on the verge of breaking. Elizabeth tried to remain calm, but the feeling of being involved in something dangerous and unknown was constant. What began as a simple family curiosity was turning into something deeper and more disturbing, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was venturing into territory she didn't fully understand. The meeting ended with a feeling of disconnection. Elizabeth said goodbye to Thomas, trying to process what she had experienced. The encounter itself had not ended in any form of physical interaction, but the tension and emotional charge were palpable. She returned home, reflecting on what she had learned and experienced. The connection between her and Thomas was becoming increasingly complex and dangerous, and what seemed like a simple family reunion had now turned into something that challenged her emotional and psychological limits. The night of May 2nd, 2024 promised to be like any other in Asheville, but fate had other plans. The atmosphere was charged with a tension that was growing by the minute, and the quiet town was about to witness an event that would change the lives of everyone involved forever. Elizabeth Turner and Thomas Turner had been in constant contact since their last meeting, and the tension between them was only increasing. The disturbing connection and increasing intensity of their encounters had placed Elizabeth in a complicated position, torn between her desire to explore her own limits and her growing discomfort with Thomas's obsession. Thomas, in turn, was increasingly consumed by the need for control and dominance. His fantasies had become an obsession, and he was determined to bring the situation to a climax. He had begun to see Elizabeth not just as a sister, but as someone he needed to possess to satisfy his deepest desires. Thomas's obsession became a destructive force that he could not control. On that fateful night, Thomas had invited Elizabeth to his apartment for a meeting. He claimed he wanted to discuss something important, something he felt needed to be resolved before they could move forward with any aspect of their relationship. Elizabeth, despite her reservations, felt she needed to confront her own feelings and try to understand what was happening. The atmosphere in Thomas's apartment was filled with almost palpable tension. He had prepared the place with decor that reflected his obsession with fetishes and control. The lights were low, and the atmosphere was oppressive. Thomas hoped the night would be a chance to finally live out his fantasies, while Elizabeth felt a growing sense of claustrophobia and anxiety. The conversation started relatively normally, but soon turned into an emotional confrontation. Thomas, visibly agitated, began to express his frustration with the way Elizabeth had distanced herself. He felt like he was being betrayed and that Elizabeth was pulling away from him, something he was not willing to accept. The tension between them reached a critical point, and Thomas became increasingly hostile and dominant. "I thought you understood, Elizabeth," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I thought I could trust you to enter this world with me. But now, I feel like you're abandoning me." Elizabeth tried to calm the situation, but her words were ignored by Thomas. He was completely consumed by the need for control, and his anger began to boil over. He confronted Elizabeth with aggressive behavior, accusing her of betrayal and disloyalty. The situation became physical, and tensions exploded into a violent dispute. During the fight, Thomas completely lost control. In a moment of fury, he began attacking Elizabeth. The apartment, once a place of disturbing discussion, turned into a scene of brutality and violence. Elizabeth tried to defend herself, but Thomas was uncontrollable. The screams and sounds of fighting were heard by neighbors, who called the police when they realized something was terribly wrong. Police arrived at the apartment about half an hour later, but what they found was a scene of indescribable horror. Elizabeth was found in a critical condition, and Thomas was still at the scene, completely disoriented and in shock. The apartment was in chaos, with evidence of violence scattered throughout the place. Thomas was arrested at the scene, and the crime scene revealed the seriousness of the situation. Elizabeth was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, she was unable to survive her serious injuries. News of the crime shocked the Asheville community, who could not believe that something so horrific could have happened in such a peaceful place. Elizabeth and Thomas's case quickly became a local media sensation. Investigations revealed disturbing details about the relationship between the two and Thomas's obsessive behavior. The story of a family reunion that ended in a brutal and senseless crime left everyone in a state of shock and sad reflection on the limits of obsession and desire. Following the horrific event on the night of May 2nd, Asheville was plunged into collective mourning as the city tried to process the shock and sadness caused by the tragedy involving Elizabeth Turner and Thomas Turner. Media coverage of the case was intense, and Thomas's name became synonymous with a crime that defied comprehension. With the city searching for answers and justice, Thomas Turner's trial was set for September 15, 2024, an event that promised to expose the darkest and most disturbing details of the case. The courtroom was packed. The room was full of journalists, family members, and onlookers, all eager to watch the trial unfold. The case had attracted national attention due to the shocking and sensational nature of the crime. TV cameras were strategically positioned, capturing every movement and every word uttered during the trial. Thomas Turner appeared in court with a forlorn expression. His look was unkempt, and he looked emotionally exhausted, a shadow of his former self. The weeks spent in prison had taken their toll, and he now faced not only legal judgment but also public judgment for his actions. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a resolute attitude, began to present the case against Thomas. He described the events of that night with cold precision, detailing the brutality of the attack and the suffering inflicted on Elizabeth. The prosecutor emphasized the calculated and obsessive nature of Thomas's behavior, presenting evidence that showed how he had planned and carried out the crime. The evidence, including witness statements and records of messages between the two, was used to paint a disturbing picture of the psychology behind the crime. Thomas's defense, on the other hand, attempted to argue that he was acting under a form of temporary delirium caused by an undiagnosed mental condition. The defense attorney presented testimony from psychologists and psychiatrists who said Thomas had shown signs of mental disorders, including obsessive desire and self-destructive behavior. The defense argued that although Thomas had committed the crime, he was partially exempt from responsibility due to his mental condition. The trial brought to light intimate and painful details about Elizabeth's life and the relationship between her half-siblings. The statements from Elizabeth's friends and family were particularly moving, showing the kind and dedicated person she was and the devastating impact of her loss. The pain and sadness of everyone who knew her was evident, and many cried during their testimonies. The prosecution also presented a forensic report that detailed Elizabeth's injuries and the violence of the attack. The photos and medical records were shown in the courtroom, adding a layer of brutality and realism to the case. Elizabeth's suffering was documented graphically, which brought an atmosphere of tension and grief to the courtroom. The verdict was announced after weeks of arguments and presentations. Thomas Turner was found guilty of first-degree murder. The court ruled that although Thomas may have had a mental condition, The severity and premeditated nature of the crime were undeniable. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial of Thomas Turner not only brought a legal conclusion, but also a deep examination of human nature and obsession. The city of Asheville, still reeling from the tragedy, tried to find a way to move forward, while Elizabeth's family struggled to overcome the pain of her loss and seek some kind of closure. The affair of Elizabeth and Thomas Turner left an indelible mark on Asheville. The city and its inhabitants have been forced to confront the reality that evil can lurk beneath the most tranquil surface and that obsession can lead to devastating consequences. The trial and its repercussions were a grim reminder of how complex and dangerous the human mind can be when it exceeds the limits of reason and control.